Given how spicy the topic of this video is, I am fairly confident that it's going to be demonetized. But just in case it is not, I have to make sure that at least 15 seconds have passed before I can utter the word sex. So please bear with me. Is it working now? Can I say sex? Let's talk about sex, baby. We may speculate all day and disagree on how humans came to be as a species, but I think we can all agree that no human can exist without sex. Jesus doesn't count. He's not human, and that's just a story. What I mean to say is that every one of us is here because two people had intercourse together. Yet despite sex being so important and ubiquitous in our lives, it is often seen as a taboo. Why is that? I don't know. I don't have all the answers. But what I can tell you is a bit about my journey with sex. And if you've had a religious upbringing, you might find it relatable. If not, you might still find it informative. One thing I want to get ahead of is how my story will be framed. It is not easy talking about a topic like this, so I hope it doesn't get misconstrued. Since I am an ex-Muslim, often what I say is viewed through the lens of a why I left Islam sort of essay, or why Islam is false. But this is neither. I didn't leave Islam because of issues I faced with the topic, nor am I trying to make a case for Islam being false because something sex. My experience was shaped by my upbringing, which involves culture and religion intertwined. Your mileage may vary. I'll be briefly touching on some potentially offensive and upsetting topics such as domestic violence and self-harm. Viewer discretion is advised. That being said, let's start from the very beginning, my early childhood years. I grew up in Saudi Arabia in a fairly moderate religious family by Middle Eastern standards. We prayed every prayer, we learned the Quran, and it wasn't uncommon for us to watch religious TV shows. We had a prayer alarm clock that went off 5 times a day, and we went to Mecca and Medina every year, sometimes multiple times a year. But we also weren't restricted from watching cartoons or movies as a family or reading books that aren't about religion. That being said, religion was always a factor in how I viewed the world. Almost everyone around me was Muslim, and every moral lesson I learned had religious connotations to it. Some things I was taught explicitly, for example, not to steal, because it is haram and because it is harmful. Some things I was taught less explicitly, like how boys being alone with girls is haram or aib. Haram is an Arabic word that means religiously forbidden, and aib is an Arabic word that literally means flaw or defect, but in that context it means shameful or frowned upon. Frowned upon by who? By family, by society, or by God. I was left to fill in the blanks, and as a young child, it wasn't spelled out to me why it was haram or aib. That was a common way in which we learned about taboo topics, or learned that these topics were taboo. We'd be told that they're aib, or talking about them is illat adab, meaning lack of manners. So from a very young age, I felt an aura of forbiddenness, discomfort, and shame around the opposite sex. One time in elementary school, I wrote a love note for a girl I had a crush on. I didn't know what love was, of course, but I vaguely recall writing something about how I think she's pretty and I'd like to be her friend. And I had just learned how to draw a rose, so I drew roses around the border of the paper. It was very wholesome, and nothing scandalous about it. And then I hid the note somewhere in my house while I tried to work up the courage to give it to the girl. Unfortunately, that never happened. My mom somehow came across that note and gently confronted me about it. I don't remember being scared of her, but I remember being embarrassed and ashamed. The one thing I remember her saying is, what if the girl's father would have seen this letter? Up until that moment, I hadn't really considered that scenario. But based on what I've experienced and witnessed, I guessed that her dad wouldn't be too pleased with me, possibly very angry and hostile towards me. Mind you, it was a very innocent note, but the lesson I learned was talking to girls and liking girls is aib, frowned upon, shameful. I was confused. When can I start to talk to girls? Was I really expected to wait until my 20s before I can interact with them? I wanted the love I saw and heard of in stories and songs, but in a halal way, and I didn't know how to build up to it. At the time, school was not segregated by gender up until the 3rd grade. Then it became severely segregated. I mean, the school was divided in half, and all the boys in the 4th grade and older were kept separate from the girls and the younger kids. I'm talking separate facilities, separate entrances, separate recess spaces. Absolutely zero mingling of the sexes was tolerated, even after school was over. Because, you see, past a certain young age, boys were treated like suspects, like problem makers that cannot be trusted, and girls were treated like fragile hidden secrets. For example, one time my younger sibling and I went to the mall to buy a Mother's Day gift, and the security guard refused to let me in because I didn't have an adult family member with me. Even though I was a child, accompanied by an even younger child, I was seen as a potential sexual predator who's going to the mall to harass women. And it's not like the security guard singled me out for that. It wasn't uncommon to treat teenage boys that way. And guess what? It tended to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because society viewed boys and men as horny animals who can't help themselves, many of them felt empowered to act like horny animals who can't help themselves. When they harassed women, the women were often asked why they put themselves in that situation. Why did she not hide every feminine feature? Why was she out without the presence of a man to protect her? Did she do something to bring attention to herself? And so on. The males might be scolded, but the mentality that boys will be boys prevailed. Harassment was seen as inevitable and can only be avoided through segregation. To play devil's advocate, or men's advocate in this case, what's the difference? Am I right, ladies? I think that the extreme gender segregation and the stigmatizing of healthy mingling plays a role in turning boys into ill-adjusted, sexually repressed potential predators. When a boy is robbed of chances to interact with girls and develop healthy, realistic views about them, he might adopt the unhealthy ideas he's fed by people around him. He might not know how to react when intrigued or aroused by a feminine feature. In fact, he might be overly aroused by ordinary things like a girl's hair or the sound of her voice. So covering up and hiding women turns out to be counterproductive in that sense, because even the contours of her covered body become a novel and arousing thing. And he might interpret ordinary physiological responses as a moral deficiency in him and as warning signs that he's about to sin or do something drastic. Because that's what he's taught, that males cannot control their manly urges. But what do I know? I'm just some guy who lived through it. Anyway, moving on to the next part of the story, puberty. That can be a confusing and distressing time for any boy, but when you add a religious upbringing to the mix, it can get even messier. I wasn't really taught much at all about the topic, so I didn't really know what to expect. All I knew was a boy reaches puberty when he starts to grow facial and pubic hair, and when he has a special dream. No explanation given. At which point it becomes even more crucial to maintain separation between the sexes, because the boy is now a man, or in other words, an animal. And I learned that once you've hit puberty, you become a man in the eyes of God, and you become fully accountable and eligible for punishment. In other words, if you die as a 14-year-old kid who just hit puberty and you sinned one too many times that week, you could go to hell. Which is why it's not uncommon to hear that some Muslims and ex-Muslims, myself included, wish to die as children to eliminate the risk of hellfire. That is morbid, but as a Muslim, you can easily find yourself romanticizing death, because that's when your real life begins. So when I hit puberty, and for a very long time after that, I didn't know what sex really was. A friend told me that it was a man and a woman touching genitals, and for a while, I actually thought that women had the same genitals as men, which made the process seem very funny, like some kind of naked sword fight. If it wasn't clear already, we didn't have any sex ed, meaning sex education. In fact, teachers skipped the reproductive system in biology class up until it was mandatory to learn about it for pre-university exams. So it was left up to the parents and sheikhs to educate kids about that. And all they taught me was premarital sex is one of the worst sins, and so is masturbation. For some reason, they fixated so hard on scaring us of masturbating, and it's probably what's caused me the most damage with regards to sex. In Arabic, it's sometimes referred to as al-'ada as-sirriya, meaning the secret habit. And even though almost everyone did it, everyone pretended they didn't, and said the most demeaning things about those who did. I suspect it was our way of denying any allegations that we ourselves were masturbators, but in reality, it led to a whole lot of internalized shame and guilt. To deter me from doing it, way after I instinctively started doing it, I was told that masturbating harmed my health, that it made my knees weak and ruined my eyesight and generally got in the way of me playing sports. And in some ways it did, because of the nocebo effect. I sometimes felt weak because I believed I did something that weakened me. And if that wasn't bad enough, the religious fear-mongering was way, way worse. I was told it's a sin, obviously, even if you only rely on your imagination. And if you masturbate, your prayers will not be accepted for 40 days. I went for Hajj once as a teenager, and I was terrified because I wasn't sure if I had masturbated in the preceding 40 days. And I felt incredibly guilty that my parents wasted money and a once-in-a-lifetime trip on a filthy, shameful, and weak sinner like me. I was also told that on the day of judgment, your body parts will testify against you and tell God about what you did in the presence of everyone you know. Not to mention that God is always watching, always, even while you touch yourself. I mean, we all have our kinks, but that's not consensual enough for me to endorse. So I just gave you a long list of reasons that would stop a perfectly rational person from ever masturbating. But I was not a perfectly rational person. Nobody is. And I was a teenager with raging hormones and a still developing frontal cortex. Even if I believed that masturbation was harmful and could lead to my eternal demise, guilt and shame and fear did not overpower that nagging biological impulse. I even rationalized doing it by thinking that it's the lesser of two evils. I remember reading a fatwa about how masturbation is permissible if it prevents you from committing an even bigger sin, like premarital sex. So I used it at times to clear my head and stop me from doing haram things like talking to girls. Newsflash, it doesn't work that way. When a lustful or impure thought crossed my mind, or if I felt aroused for any reason, I'd panic and I'd think of myself as a morally deficient sinner. I try all sorts of techniques to dismiss the haram thoughts and prevent them from happening in the first place, but none of them worked. For example, I was told that exercise helps as a distraction, so I exercised a lot, which boosted my testosterone and did nothing to prevent my sexual arousal. And it also increased my sex appeal, which was counterproductive at the time. And sometimes I tried to masturbate the arousal away to minimize the time I spent thinking about sex, which ended up Pavloving me in a way. I know now that it's perfectly healthy and normal for a boy to have arousing thoughts, especially when his reproductive system is coming online for the first time. But I didn't know that then. I felt like a flawed and weak-willed sinner and a terrible Muslim. I didn't have a way of seeking help because the topic was seldom talked about. It was shameful and embarrassing, and turning to God and prayer did nothing to help. I sometimes blamed women for being the temptation that triggered my forbidden desires, so I identified with arguments for covering up and hiding women. But I often turned the blame inwards, especially when I realized that no amount of isolation from the opposite sex would do the trick. Sometimes I'd be triggered by something as random as the temperature of a swimming pool. Another trigger was, believe it or not, the Quran. Namely, verses that mention Hur al-Ain, which are heavenly sex maidens created purposely for good Muslim men's enjoyment. As a horny, sexually repressed teenager, how could I read about a harem of an all-you-can-fuck buffet and not have lingering thoughts about it? Got me all bricked up after Isha prayer for no good reason. I'm sorry. I always thought I was uniquely and deeply flawed, and I needed help to dismiss all thoughts about sex from my terrified religious brain. The only advice I ever found was to avoid temptation, to pray harder, and don't talk openly about sex. Aib, illit adab. I suspect people thought that talking more openly about sex would make us think about it more and make us more likely to do it, but in reality they did implicitly talk or think about sex all the time. There's a common phrase that stems from a hadith, shaitanu thalithuhuma, meaning when a man and a woman are left alone, the devil is their third, working tirelessly to tempt them into sexual desire. In reality, the devil does not exist. Religion and society's obsession with sex does exist. If I see a girl and I'm taught to think, don't think about sex, don't be alone with her, don't think about sex, don't think about sex, guess what I'll be thinking about? Even if I'm not attracted to her, I felt anxious and sinful around her, and I learned to associate females with sex in any context. I can't and I don't blame myself for that. Like I said, everyone around me was obsessed with sex in an indirect way. For example, despite gender mixing being extremely frowned upon, if not illegal at the time, there were still a few places where a boy and a girl could hang out in public without being arrested or questioned. When seen together, the boy was quickly labeled a niswanji or bita banat or something similar, meaning a womanizer. A lot of negatives would be presumed about his character and his priorities in life. Similarly, if not worse, a girl seen with a boy was called easy, slutty, loose, and ill-mannered. The pair would be presumed guilty of sexual relations or something adjacent to it, sometimes implanting these thoughts into their heads, since society seems suspicious of them anyway. The world I grew up in had a way of making everyone paranoid about sex and tainting innocent curiosity with the fear of haram escalation. One time, past my bedtime, I was texting a girl on my phone. Her MSN status said that it was her brother's birthday, so I wished him a happy birthday. Not the best opener, I know, but it was pretty clean and innocent. I was caught with my phone in my hand, and my phone was searched, then smashed, and I got the living hell beaten out of me for communicating with a girl. I was also threatened with being publicly humiliated at school, with my misdeeds advertised to everybody. The next day, I had to go to school, bruises and all, and pretend that none of it happened. Unfortunately, stories like these aren't uncommon where I come from. Islam does allow for corporal punishment against women and children, and society at large doesn't intervene with what they consider to be family matters, left up to the man of the house. Anyway, I learned through many experiences that it's not productive or safe to talk to family about anything girl-related. So this confusing and anxious mess of a teenagehood continued for a few more years, and at some point I lived in a gated community that afforded us more freedom. For example, women weren't allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia at the time, but inside the gated community they did. Girls didn't have to wear abayas in public, and there wasn't as much segregation as in the rest of the country. I made a few female friends over the years, and I developed some late and sorely needed social skills. So I recognized that it could have been worse had I not been privileged enough to have opportunities to mingle with the opposite sex to some extent, which brings us to the next chapter of my story, early adulthood. I left the gender-segregated minefield that is Saudi Arabia and headed to a non-Muslim country to pursue a university degree. And the place I moved to was by no means a utopia of gender equality and equity, but compared to the entirety of the Middle East, it pretty much was. Girls and women weren't leered at for not being covered in black. They could drive, and the only barriers between me and interacting with them were my social skills, which admittedly needed some work at the time. Oh, and also my confusion about religion. I knew I wanted a halal life and a halal wife, so I struggled to figure out where to draw the line with my interactions with women. If I went strictly by the book, if I wanted to be the best Muslim I could be, then I'm not supposed to talk to women unless absolutely necessary. And when I do, I'm not supposed to make eye contact or shake their hands. And there are people who operate that way. They tend to get sneered at for behaving so bizarrely, sometimes by other Muslims. But I feel for them. I know they're trying to do what they think is the right thing, to save themselves and the other person from lust and sin and hellfire. At first, I maintained a degree of separation with women, only hanging out with them if accompanied by a group and in public, never alone. I wouldn't allow myself to have any lustful thoughts about real women I knew. If I did, I scolded myself for it. And I say real because I had subconsciously classified women I met as real, and public figures on TV or in pornography or otherwise as a different, unreal class. If I had lustful thoughts about a real woman, I worried that she would get sins counted against her. But if I had thoughts about a public figure, she'd still get some sins counted against her, but she sort of signed up for it by being so visible in the public eye. I know it seems silly now, but so do a lot of beliefs I used to hold. Anyway, despite having a busy and active life, I couldn't get rid of my sexual urges because, duh. By that time, I had been working out regularly, so I was in good shape, and I wasn't a complete idiot around women, so I received some interest from Muslim and non-Muslim women, which I wasn't used to. And instead of pursuing it, I often avoided it and retreated to self-love to avoid greater sin, like entertaining the possibility of being physically intimate with someone. Paradoxically, I sought comfort in something that made me anxious and guilty. I say self-love, but I viewed it as self-hatred or self-harm, because if I truly loved myself, why would I harm myself by sinning? I must hate myself, or so I thought. And I mean that in two ways. I figured I must have masturbated because I hate myself, and if for a day I didn't hate myself, then I must, because I am a sinner. I'm worthy of hatred. If people praised me or called me a good person, I denied myself the pleasure of accepting the compliment, because ever since I hit puberty, I've always felt like a bad person, and if only people found out my shameful secrets, they would think I'm a bad person too. Fast forward to the first time I actually had sex. I was still a Muslim at the time, and I had resisted it for so long, but one day the stars just aligned and it was easier for me to go ahead with it than to back out of it. And I wasn't pressured or anything, but I wasn't confident or mature enough to tell the person exactly how I felt, which is that I was unsure and maybe I should sleep over it first. Alone, that is. Regardless, it happened, and immediately after the deed was done, I regressed into a state of shock. I felt as if I had just killed someone and that person was me, or the more pure version of me. Had I signed my own death certificate for a bit of intimacy? I felt remorseful. I felt tainted, spoiled, rotten, ashamed, doomed, and several dozen more adjectives, none of them being pleasant. I repented immediately, but that did very little to change how I felt. I felt as if I was in imminent danger because I hadn't yet faced immediate consequences for my sin. I remembered the verse in Surah An-Nur that said, "The fornicators lash them 100 lashes." As fucked up as it sounds, I thought of this verse a lot because I had memorized the verse from a very young age and recited it during prayer. That's just the reality of being an Arabic-speaking Muslim who tries to be familiar with his religion. So please stop teaching this rubbish to children. It can really do some damage. I knew that nobody was going to lash me because, thank God, I didn't live in an Islamic state, but I felt as if I deserved to be lashed. I felt a survivor's guilt, and eventually I tried to lash myself to pay off my debt. And of course, it did not work that way. If you ever have thoughts of self-harm, please take a deep breath, find someone you can confide in, and get some help. I know from experience that self-harm is never the correct answer. Going back to the story, I felt as if I had downgraded myself to the status of a fornicator. I felt like damaged goods. And I remembered the verse in Surah An-Nur again that said, a male fornicator would only marry a female fornicator or a polytheist, which is pretty funny when you think about it, that God equates fornicating Muslim women to polytheists. But at the time I was preoccupied with the first part, that I only deserved to be with a woman who did what I did, who felt about herself the way I felt about myself. Even if I somehow managed to end up with a virgin and I circumvented the verse, I would have felt too guilty to keep my past a secret. I wondered if I had the guts to admit my sins to my future wife, or if my punishment was that I live in perpetual shame of the secret that I carry. Like many Muslim men around me, I used to be extremely insecure, jealous, and obsessed with what I thought of as sexual purity. It was drilled into me that a real man has ghira. A real man would not want a woman who's been touched by another man, otherwise he's a dayuth, a cuckold. As this verse of Surah Ar-Rahman says, good believers are promised heavenly maidens who only look at them and have never been touched by any human or jinn. That was the ideal for a Muslim man, and I was devastated that I could never have that, at least not in this life. This ghira made me think too much about my future wife's sex life. I'd get jealous when a girl flirted with me, especially if she's a Muslim, because I thought to myself, I wonder who else she might have flirted with. I wonder if she would have flirted with someone else if I wasn't here. I would make myself jealous of fictional scenarios because I expected that my punishment for my sin would be a partner who makes me jealous. Eventually, I found myself yearning for companionship and intimacy once again, not particularly sex. I tried to only meet Muslim women or women who understood my preference for avoiding premarital relations, and even when I did sin, I somehow felt morally superior to those who sin freely, because at least I felt bad about it. By that time, I had already lost a lot of faith because of unanswerable questions and various plot holes, but my fear kept me from fully questioning the validity of the religion. Who was I but a filthy, guilty, morally repugnant sinner? How dare I question the Lord? So even when it would have served me best to shed all that guilt and throw the whole religion away, I couldn't do it. I was too busy pointing fingers at myself to point any at Islam. Later on, I met a hijabi girl who I really got along with, and things were going great, but there were a couple of hiccups. She wasn't bothered by my past experiences, but I wanted her to be. I wanted to enforce the religious mindset on both of us, and she also wanted to get physically intimate for the first time with me, and I wanted to keep it halal till marriage. Mostly because I intended to repent and stay away from sin, but partly because I thought of her as not yet tainted. I didn't want to be the one to defile a virgin woman, as opposed to a woman who independently chose to be tainted, like me. Throughout my adult years, I've made many connections. Some flourished into relationships and some didn't. I made many mistakes and I learned from them. And looking back at it now, I recognize that I partook in some unhealthy and potentially hurtful behavior because of how I felt about myself. For the majority of my life, I could not have an orgasm without feeling terrible about it, so I got accustomed to always feeling terrible about it. I felt like a spoiled degenerate for wanting healthy intimacy. I'd say I have no regrets, but I'd be lying. I regret any hurt that I caused some of my partners over the years because of my confusing and damaging relationship with sex and Islam. I regret the years I spent wallowing in self-hatred when I should have been enjoying my youth and developing healthy relationships. But I try not to blame myself. I try not to play the blame game at all. I recognize the factors that led to my experiences, and I recognize the lessons that I learned from them. I no longer think of myself or my partner as tainted or used up or unworthy of love unless it's with the first person they're intimate with. I view women as human beings with feelings and motivations as complicated as mine, not as unidimensional temptresses. I don't obsess over my partner's past, and I recognize that they too, just like me, were on their journey to find their match, and that everything in their life and mine led us exactly to where we need to be to find each other. Everything I've been through, mistakes and tragedies and all, factors into who I am today. I wish I had a step-by-step guide on how to heal, but since it was an accumulation of many years of gradual change, it's not that simple for me to summarize, and everyone's journey is different anyway. Deconstructing my religious beliefs was certainly a catalyst for me because it got me questioning all my beliefs and presuppositions, not just the ones that have to do with God directly. I also took an active role in identifying and addressing my issues, sometimes asking for help from other members of my community or by seeking therapy. And to this day, I'm always a work in progress. I'm not telling you my story to encourage you to be careless or reckless about sex. That is a false dichotomy that is often presented to us by our religious upbringing, that you're either a pure virgin or a dirty harlot. You're either a controlling misogynist or a spineless youth. I'm here to tell you that life is too short to live by the Puritan rules of a long-dead man who, by the way, had a harem of wives and trafficked human beings for slavery and sex. What the heck does he know about dating? I implore you to ditch the antiquated customs and find what works for you, what enables you to have a happy and healthy life. I'm choosing to be extremely vulnerable because I know this is unprecedented in my world. I know there are many people out there who go through the same struggles but think that they're uniquely hopeless. You are not alone, and you're definitely not hopeless. I sincerely hope that what I shared with you today gives you some perspective on what you or someone else might be going through. I think it can also help contextualize men's behavior in the Middle East. Not excuse it, mind you, but contextualize it. Perhaps this can help some of them acknowledge their inner struggles and deal with them instead of projecting them on women. This could also serve as a bit of a cautionary tale for those who think that sex ed should be restricted. Information will always find its way to children, so it's better to arm them with a robust understanding of the topic rather than them finding out in less pleasant ways. If you have any experiences of your own that you'd like to share, please do so in the comments below. And if you'd like to join a community where you can openly discuss such topics in a safe and supportive environment, consider joining our Discord server, Aladdin. All you gotta do is become a patron or YouTube member and connect your Discord account. Links are in the description below. I'd like to thank all of my supporters for enabling me to do the work that I do. This would not be possible without your donations. And this channel is by far the most meaningful work I've ever done, and I'm grateful that I get a chance to do it. So thank you for watching, and as always, think critically and think for yourself. And consider watching one of these videos next.